Hello, all of you wayward spirits. So, because season 3 has officially ended, I thought I would share something fun with you today. Here is the new exclusive podcast that will now be airing weekly, but only for Patreon members. In this series, I will be diving even deeper into all of the lore, most of which we don't really see in Supernatural. So, there are going to be a lot of lore that we're not going to talk about on the podcast, like Pandora's Box, for instance. So, do you want to join me on the hunt? If so, go to Patreon and look for Wayward Spirit, or go to Wayward Spirit Pod on Instagram and click the link in bio. But if you want a sneak peek of what an episode is like, just keep listening. Hello and welcome to the exclusive podcast for all of my wayward spirits on Patreon. First of all, if you are hearing this now, I love you so much. Like, seriously, so much. Thank you so much for supporting my podcast. It means everything to me. All right. Well, all of you wayward spirits, today we are going to dive deep into the lore of fairies. Yes, fairies, and I am so freaking excited. So get this. Fairies can actually be known by a different name, fae. And in Middle English, the fairy or fae meant enchantment. Most are thought to have magic powers and are very small creatures but have tiny human-like features. And you might be thinking that fairies are nice and helpful creatures, like Tinkerbell from Peter Pan. Well, actually, the Fae folk have somewhat of a bad and meddling reputation. But again, like most lore, fairies are looked at differently in different cultures. In European culture, they are invisible supernatural creatures, kind of like in Supernatural. Similar to Supernatural, they live in the same realm with us now, we just can't always see them. They are also thought to have knowledge beyond this realm, which helps them make time either slower or faster for those who encounter them. In Scottish folklore, the good fairies, which are called the Seelie Court, are nice and actually help humans, but the bad fairies are called the Unseelie Court, and they are most known for malice and mischief. They ruin or steal crops, take your drink or food, they can milk cows and ride horses. They blow out candles and disrupt households. I just think that's so great that they ride horses. Most of the time, the pranks are actually punishment for a perceived wrong on a human's part. So basically, the fairies are mad, so they're punishing the humans. So, see, they're not all good. But, I mean, if you really think about it, Tinkerbell was a little mischievous and did have a bit of an attitude when provoked. So, I guess Disney wasn't that far off. In the pagan religion, fairies are seen as demoted pagan deities that would be worshipped as a minor goddess of nature and tree spirits. But after Christianity began, fairies were demoted even more to folklore beliefs, fairy tales, and in some cases can even be condemned as evil beings. So, as you can see, fairy lore is very different depending on who you ask. So now let's talk about some of the common fairy lore. Fairies have the ability to become invisible at their own choosing, and they can choose to disappear, change their shape, and appear as human beings. They can even shapeshift and cast illusions. And these are called glamour, which is a Scottish term that means the magical ability to deceive the eye of the receiver. They also live extremely long, if not immortal. They are thought to live in the woodlands or underneath rocks and stones. So there are thought to be two different kinds of fairies. The fairy race or nation are thought to live in fairyland, which is a structured society. And they're actually not alone. Dwarfs are thought to live there too. The solitary fairies were connected to occupation, local cities, or even particular households. And these include water sprites and shoemaker leprechauns, like we see in Supernatural as well. Now, let's talk about fairy encounters. So, the stories we're going to talk about today are random sightings, but it is well known that if you stumble upon a mushroom circle in the woods, it would be best to stay out of that circle. That is a fairy circle, and some actually seek them out to encounter a fairy because they believe that fairies will give them a gift. But that is not what these next encounters go through. A summer in 1884, a mail cart driver set out to collect mail from the surrounding areas and bring back to the collection center. After gathering all the mail, he was on his way back and just 6 miles to the end of his trip when he encountered a troop of fairies. They were dressed in red and carrying lanterns. The fairies stopped in front of his horse and threw his mailbags onto the road, and they started to dance around about the bags. The mail cart driver was very frustrated and proceeded to try to get the bags back into the cart. But as soon as he managed to place one in the cart, the fairies would toss it out all over again. And this kept on until sunrise. And then the fairies left the mail cart driver, leaving him frustrated and very late to get home. All right, here's the next story. So on May 1913, three young brothers, Sibby, Sid, and Clyde, were chopping cotton in their family farm when all of a sudden their dog started barking frantically at something. The boys went to go see what it was, and when they did, they found a small man who was only 18 inches tall, who was green all over. But that was all the boys were able to see before the dog attacked him and tore him into pieces. The boys went back to work, unsure what to think. They didn't know what this was. And the dogs followed them back and actually stayed with them the whole day, as if they were frightened by something. And a couple hours later, the brothers wanted to go back and check and make sure the body actually existed, and it did. They saw it again. But when they told their parents, they didn't believe the boy's story. And by the next day, all the evidence of that little man's existence was gone, as if he'd never been there. Here is our last story. In 1937, the Fairy Investigation Society of England received a letter from a young woman who had experienced a very strange encounter while staying at an old house in Gloucester. The house had a garden that was actually attached to a forest, and one day the young woman staying there walked outside into the garden into the woods. And one day, after washing her hair, the young woman walked outside into the forest, when all of a sudden she felt an odd tugging on her hair. She turned to look and discovered a little man that was only 9 inches tall, and he was all tangled up in her hair. His skin was green and he had this high squeaky voice and was complaining that she had no right to be there. And as they both struggled with her hair, he was able to free himself and he just suddenly disappeared. Crazy, right? Like, that's insane. And the fact that there's actually a fairy investigation society, like, really intrigues me. Like, I want to go on a fairy investigation now. Like, seriously, that sounds so fun. Actually, I don't know. I mean, we'll see. In those stories that we talked about, it's just like mischievous, but there are some other stories. I couldn't find any, but I know that there are other stories of like fairies bringing like bad luck and stuff. So you do have to be careful with fairies. It's actually really funny. I learned it was in Charmed where they were friends with like the leprechauns and the fairies and the gnomes, I think. and they would always like come in and they're like, if you ever like misplace something, or if something goes missing or something like that, if something goes like, if little things are going wrong, most times it's like a fairy or a leprechaun. And that was in Charmed. And so now every time I lose something or I misplace something or I forget something, I'm always like, oh my goodness, those fairies and leprechauns are messing with me right now. Well, all right. Thank you so much for listening and being a Patreon member. I truly couldn't do this without you. And I hope you enjoyed this fun lore as much as I did. And I will see you all next week. And don't forget to stay spooky. All right. Well, I really hope you enjoyed that sneak peek of the new exclusive podcast that will be on Patreon. If you want to hear this podcast, go to Patreon and check out Wayward Spirits and become a Patreon member. It would mean the world to me, and it would really, really help in supporting my podcast. So if you want to hear this new fun podcast, go check it out on Patreon. Well, all right. Thank you so much for listening. And I will see you all next week when the season 4 trailer will be up. Yes, check out the season 4 trailer next week. And don't forget to stay spooky. Bye.